Today we have the speaker from other continent, Martin in US right now. He's executive director of Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship from Old Dominion University. And the topic is due diligence. Is so important for a startup. And now we start. Martin, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you so much. And let's start.
Okay. Well, it's great to be with you. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
As you know, I usually do this presentation in person, and I've been to Ukraine, I think, 10 times in the last few years, and I always prefer to come and be there because I love your country and I love meeting all the entrepreneurs and all of the excited people who come to these sorts of events. So I wish I was there with you, and maybe next year I can be. Now, before I get going, let me say a few other things. I've already been warned to slow down and not speak as quickly as I usually do. And that's difficult for me, but I will do my best. And if for some reason I start to speak too fast, I hope someone will warn me. The second thing I'll mention is, as you know, I'm an American, and that means I don't speak English. What I really speak is some version of English that we Americans speak. So there may be some phrases and terms and words that don't translate very well to Ukrainian. So again, if there's a particular thing that I say that doesn't translate or that is confusing in some way, please don't hesitate to stop me and say, could you please explain that in English? And I'll do my best to do that. So the other thing I'll mention is I usually give this presentation, again, in person, but I can do it whether it's a 20-minute version or I can do a 1-hour version. What I'll try to do today is about the 45-minute to 50-minute version, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end of the discussion. But also, if there are immediate questions that you want to have answered, don't hesitate to stop me, and we'll just take the time to answer your question right when you're ready to hear it. So we can make this as interactive as possible given the constraints of online and Zoom. So with that in mind, let me get going. And again, warn me if I go too fast. So yeah, my name is Marty Kaszubowski. I work for a university these days, but that's still not really, it's still a strange thing for me. I'm an entrepreneur, investor. I used to run an incubator back in the olden days. So I've been working with entrepreneurs and with investors for almost 25 years here in the US, but again, also in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Belarus. So I've worked on these kinds of projects for a number of years. And I always enjoy doing this overseas because it gives me a good opportunity to see how you think and how you have to deal with issues surrounding entrepreneurship. So yeah, let me get going. We're going to talk today about getting ready for due diligence. And this is a topic that I think too often gets left to the end of the process when you start to think about raising money for your venture. And I believe it's important to think about it sooner rather than later, and to really begin to understand what it's going to take for you to describe your business, your value proposition, your customer interactions to an investor in ways that the investor will understand. So I think the sooner you begin to think about these things, the better you'll be when it really does come time to try to raise money. Okay, so let's get going. First off, I'm hoping I can do this. There we go. It's important to remember just what it means to fund a startup company. And you've all probably seen a chart like this, where you have revenues on one side and time on the bottom. And at the very beginning, you're spending more money than you're making. We call that the valley of death. And it's meant to scare you a little bit, but it's a thing that every startup company goes through. And this is really why you think about raising money fairly early in your growth. Early in the process, you're typically raising money from your friends, your family, angel investors, which I'll describe in more detail in a bit. Later on, as the company starts to grow, you might be talking to different kinds of angels, but also venture capitalists. And then, of course, as you grow beyond that, then you're talking to late stage venture capitalists, strategic partners, banks, other sorts of enterprises to give you larger amounts of money. So again, I think you've probably all seen a chart like this, but it's always important to remember that this is how the process is going to work overall. The other thing to really keep in mind, again, sooner rather than later, is what is your stage? Where are you in the growth of your idea and your company? First off, it's simply idea stage. You have a great idea. You think there might be a business in here somewhere. You've started to talk to customers. You maybe have a little bit of a prototype, but not quite. And you're really counting on your own resources, or in some cases, money from friends and other people to keep you alive, to keep you moving down the path of figuring out what your business is going to be. The second stage, of course, is the seed stage. That's where you probably have a prototype that works mostly, but you need funding to really improve that prototype and begin to get to market in ways that you can get validation of your company, traction for your company. So that seed stage is a very critical time when most companies start to think about raising money from outside sources. Not always, but often. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward as well. The third stage, as we know, is scaling up. That means you've got something that works. The customers are starting to give you very solid feedback about how much they like your product. And now you need money to hire your team, to get a production process in place, to begin to turn yourself into a real company in some sense. Now, most of you, again, I wish I was there because I could ask you these questions, but I'm going to presume that most of you are in one of these three stages or know people who are. So I'll mostly focus on these kinds of stages: idea stage, the seed stage, and the scale stage. And it's important to keep that in mind because you need to know when you talk to an investor what stage you're in, because that will determine in many ways the kind of conversation you'll have with this investor. Okay, so know your stage. Think right now about what stage you're in and how you begin to articulate, describe your business to a potential investor. Okay, this is important. This came out, I think, 2 years ago, but it really hasn't changed much. This is the top 10 reasons why startup companies fail. Now, this is for US companies, but again, I've been all around the world talking to startup companies everywhere from Thailand to Australia to Belarus to obviously Ukraine, and it's the same. The single biggest reason why companies fail is because they are a solution looking for a problem. What I mean by that is you're building something that nobody really wants. And what you have to be diligent about earlier rather than later, sooner, as soon as you can, is talk to your customers, talk to people who have a problem that you can actually solve. Don't build something just because you think it's cool or because it's fun. It has to be something that customers want. And that's about 40% of all failures, is that kind of a thing. We often say to entrepreneurs, your problem is you don't have a problem. You are a solution looking for a problem. So don't be a solution looking for a problem. And this is important because the majority of the questions that you'll be asked about your business, particularly early when you're looking for money, is what problem are you solving? Have you talked to your potential customers about why they want this problem solved? And do you have something that will actually solve that problem? So that's important to remember. Don't be a solution looking for a problem. Now, the other group that's interesting is the team. And you'll see number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. These are all about who you hire and when, how you keep focus in your business, which is really a team problem. Have you failed to execute? In other words, how good are you at sales and marketing and operations? And then do you really have the right founders within your team? So the team really matters. So this is the other large area where investors are going to want to focus on your business and why they should put money into your business. The other thing I'll mention is it's not always about the money. And I'm not sure you can even read this, but number 6 and number 7 are, number 6 is chasing investors instead of customers. Think about that. How many times have you heard a founding team say, we are spending so much of our time trying to raise money that we can't actually get customers? What I always encourage people is to focus more on the customers than on the raising money to the extent that you possibly can, because investors are going to want to know a lot about your customers, and don't fall into the trap of looking for money instead of looking for customers. And then number 7 is interesting too. It's not making sure that you have enough money. Now, that's a problem, of course. You have to look for money to get money, to spend money. But yeah, it's not always about the money. It really is, as I said earlier, about don't be a solution looking for a problem, and make sure that your team is really ready to begin to execute the business as you can envision it. Okay, so I'm just going to hammer this again. Not all problems can be solved with money. It'd be nice if that was the case, but it's not the case. Truth is, money is very good at helping you write more code, create your prototypes, get more sales leads, help your team grow. It helps you get to market faster. That's what money can do for you. What it can't do, and will never do, is know what code to write, know what prototypes to build and how to test them, how to convince your customers to buy your product, how to talk to your customers, right? You as the founding team of your enterprise have to be ready to get deeply engaged on a daily basis with your customers and what problems they need to have solved. And money can't help you do that. Money will help you get to market once you understand where the market is. So remember that. If you are thinking of outside investment, and we'll get into more details in a bit about the kinds of investors you want to look for and what questions they're going to ask and some more details. But at the high level, if you are starting to think about getting investment from outside your company or outside your own resources, there are a handful of things that you really need to have in place. And don't overthink these. Don't spend too much time worrying about having all of these perfect, but you need to at least have these in process or ready to go to some level before you start thinking too seriously about getting outside investment. The first one is simply you have to have a legal entity. You might be surprised, even in the US, how often we as investors are approached by people who have not much more than an idea and haven't even bothered to form a company or form some sort of legal enterprise that the money could go into. So even if I were to write them a check to send them money, they wouldn't have a way to use it. So first things first, make sure you have some sort of legal entity that can be the home for your business. Second thing is, we'll talk about this in more detail later, but it's very important to begin to protect your intellectual property. And I use that phrase, intellectual property, in a very broad sense. It's not necessarily a patent. Many founders, many entrepreneurs think that they have to go get a patent on their idea or a patent on their prototype immediately. And that's often not the case. And it's often not the case because, one, it may not be patentable. But two, as you start to go down the process of patenting, things change. And you often realize that it's not the thing that you really want to put into your product that you really want to have it something else. And that's why it's important to get to your prototype stage, but then begin to think about what of this can I protect? And sometimes it's a patent, but as often as not, it's a trade secret or some other way of simply walling off or not saying anything about the technology. Now, let me make something really clear. Being secretive about your technology is not the same as being secretive about your business. It's very important to talk a lot with other people about your business, about the problem you're solving. And you can do that without having you talk about the details of your technology or your solution, right? You don't have to tell people that you've invented anti-gravity or warp drive or something that is near magic. You just have to tell them, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, and here's why it matters. But as I said earlier, the sooner you can begin to protect that intellectual property, whether it's as a trade secret or a patent or a copyright or some other form, begin to do that because it's something that investors are going to want to talk about. The third thing is, it's very important to begin surrounding yourself with other people who can give you advice and access to networks and help you build relationships and bring industry and technical expertise into your business. You're probably brilliant. I'm gonna believe that everyone in the room listening to my voice is brilliant and capable and knows the problems they want to solve. But it still helps to have other people surrounding you who can help you think through some of those issues as you go forward. So start building an advisory board as soon as you possibly can. Because again, as an investor, I'm going to want to hear who else is giving you advice, who else is supplying you with access to networks and markets. So think about it, an advisory board. Have a minimum viable product. I'm sure you're familiar with that term. We'll say a little bit about it in a second too. While I'm thinking of it, minimum viable product, that's three different things. Minimum is easy, right? It's easy to do something that only solves parts of a problem. It's the viable part of MVP that is the difficult one. How do you know that it's viable? It's because customers have told you that it's viable and that that's what they want to have you build. It may not be the whole solution. It won't be the whole solution, but it needs to be something that the customers actually want to have done and will pay money to get. So having minimum viable product ready to go. And know your customer segment. Now this is a particular term, customer segment. What I mean by that is if you think about your total addressable market, all of the people who might be able to buy your product, it is almost always the case that as we talk to entrepreneurs and founding teams, they will overestimate, sometimes completely overestimate, the number of people who will actually buy their product. So when we talk about customer segment, it's almost always the case that you have to drill down much, much, much deeper than you would otherwise. And we do entire seminars on this topic, so I won't try to cover it too much here. But trust me when I say that the people you think of as your customer segment right now is probably bigger than it really is. And it will be time well spent if you can spend more of your time drilling down and really thinking about why this part of that group would buy and this part might not. So know your customer segment as soon as you possibly can before you start to think and talk about the outside investment. It's important to have a plan. And again, we'll talk more about specifics of due diligence as we go forward here, but much of the discussion with investors is, what are your milestones? How is your product going to evolve? How are you going to build your team? How are you going to build your operational capacity? And you have to have those things laid out in some sense. Again, you don't have to have all the answers because you won't have all the answers, but you have to have something that says we've thought deeply about how we're going to go from where we are to where we need to be. And why that's important mostly is because the investor, particularly at the early stage, wants to know that if he or she writes you a check for a certain amount of money, that money will help you get from this milestone to that milestone, right? What am I buying for my money? What I want to be able to buy for my money is to help you get from here to there. And if you don't have a plan, then it's impossible to say, if you give me money, I can go from here to there. So have a plan. The final thing, it's never the final thing, but the last thing on this chart at least is know how much your company is worth. Now you won't know how much your company is worth, but at least take a guess. Is it worth $1 million? Is it worth $10 million? Is it worth $2.563 million? I don't know, you don't know, but take a guess. Try to build up a little bit of financial information from the bottom up. If we sell this many products, if we have this much of a customer base, if we have this many expenses, if we think the market's going to grow this much over time, we believe our company is worth this much. Maybe that's 2.5 million, maybe it's 10, maybe it's less, I don't know. But you need to have some sense of that before you start to try to raise other people's money. Because again, what the investor is going to want to know is, if I give you $200,000, how much of the company do I then own? Is that 10% or is that 90%? I want to know. And you need to have some sense of how much your company is worth as soon as you can. Again, even if it's just a guess, know a little bit about what that value is, because that's where you're going to spend a lot of your time negotiating with an investor. Okay, so establish a legal entity, protect your intellectual property, start an advisory board, have an MVP, know who your customers really are, have a plan of milestones to the extent that you possibly can, and at least take a guess at how much your company is worth. And you'll start to be ready finally to begin to talk to some investors. Okay, now I'm going to drill in even more detail on some of this, and then later I'm going to give you a worst case example, right? The worst possible example that you'll have to do this due diligence process. And I'm going to do that because I want to scare you a little bit, not too much, but I want to scare you a little bit so you're ready when the time comes. Okay, so one last thing I'll mention, because I get asked this all the time. When should we start talking to investors? Should we start talking to investors when we're ready to raise money? Should we start talking to investors long before we raise money? Or should I wait until I really, really, really need the money? The answer is start as soon as you possibly can. As we always say, the best time to raise money is when you don't need money, because it takes time and it's so dependent on the relationships that you have with investors. So really, the message here is start now, even if you don't believe you're going to be raising money until 6 months from now or a year from now. The sooner you can talk to some investors, the better, because you'll learn about their interests, they'll learn about you, they'll follow along as you're growing your company. And when the time does come, you'll have trust between you and them, and the process will go much, much smoother. By the way, I did this presentation a few days ago, and I realized for the first time ever that if you look at these two puzzle pieces, they're never going to fit. I didn't realize that these two people, as much as they might like to, they're probably never going to get together. And that's a bit of an interesting metaphor that I just realized, because sometimes, in fact, maybe often, as you start building relationships, what you're really going to realize is that you don't want to try to raise money from this investor because you don't trust him, or you don't like him, or they're just not in your business. So the sooner you start building those relationships, the more likely you are to know where you're going to go, who you trust, and really smooth that process for raising money. So start now, and don't be shy about talking to investors sooner rather than later. So are you ready for due diligence? The answer is probably not. And by the way, this is a very scary sort of picture, which I put in here specifically because a lot of people are very, I won't say terrified, but they're concerned about their ability to participate in these kind of meetings, because they are difficult and they are contentious in some cases, and it is a negotiation. So are you ready? Probably not, but as we get through this and as you begin to talk to investors, I'm reasonably confident that you will figure it out and you'll be ready when the time comes. So what I'm going to do now, and I've got about, I think, half an hour or so to go, which is plenty. I want to talk about what are investors looking for, and then I want to talk a little bit about the process of due diligence and how you'll go through that. And then, as I said earlier, I want to give you sort of an example of some of the questions and negotiations that you'll have to entertain and go into as you go through the due diligence process. So 5 things that investors usually believe they need to have. And this is, probably nothing that will surprise you. I've alluded to some of this earlier. You really do need to have some sort of validated business model. And I'm going to presume that most of you are familiar with what a business model is. If you're not familiar with the business model canvas or some other similar approach to that, please let me know or talk to some folks that you trust, and we can help you kind of figure out what a business model really is when we say those words. And validated is important. Mostly, the validation of a business model relates to customer segmentation. Is the value proposition that surrounds your business and your product really something that will provide value to your customers? Have you really understood what the cost structure of your business is? Have you really understood what the revenues are potentially for your business? Have you really understood that if you think there are 10 different markets, maybe only 2 of them are where you want to run first, and you've talked to customers in those 2 that have told you they like what you're doing and they really have validated the business model. So a validated business model has a number of definitions, but we investors generally know it when we see it. And it usually relates to how deeply have you talked to your customers and understood the costs and revenues associated with your business. I mentioned this earlier, the team, depending on what kind of investor you talk to, the team is, if not the most important, it's certainly right there with the validated model. Because when all is said and done, somebody has to wake up every morning and worry about what can we do as a team today to move the process along, to make some sort of progress in our business. And if the team is dysfunctional, if they don't get along, if they can't work together, if they have different vision for how the company progresses, if they just don't have the skills, that's something that will come out in your discussions with investors. So the team has to be able to deliver. I mentioned the minimum viable product. I always focus on the viable part of it because, again, that relates to have customers told us what they really want. It's very important, I think, most investors think that you have some sort of traction. Now, traction is a term that gets thrown about without a lot of definition. And it does define differently in different markets. So enterprise software traction might mean one thing, whereas a hardware product might mean a different thing. But nonetheless, as you talk to investors, they're going to want to know, what's your traction? Who's buying this thing? Do you have any testimonials from happy customers? Have you heard from government agencies or other sort of organizations that they really value what you're doing? So think very seriously about what sort of traction you have. And then finally, on this chart at least, partnerships. There has never been a successful startup company that hasn't had some partnership with an important player in their market. Sometimes that's a supplier, sometimes it's a major customer, sometimes it's an ultimate acquisition partner. It's somebody who has a strategic interest in the success of your company. So think very seriously about who those strategic partnerships might be, because when it does come time for you to go from 2 people and 10 lines of code to 200 people and big activities all over the world, you're going to need some partnership to help you get there. So So those 5 things are what are in general the kind of things that investors are going to want to have in place. And typically they're going to ask fairly specific questions. I'll go even more detail on these in a second. Who are your management team? Are they full-time? Do they have a day job and you're only doing this on weekends? That's not good. Are they good people? Do they have integrity? Have they shown that they can meet their commitments? Are they creative? Are they coachable? Who are these people? Let's get to know them. In fact, what you'll find often is that investors will want to spend a lot of time with your team. They'll want to go out to dinner. They'll want to go out for drinks. Some might want to go play golf. I don't know what it is you do in Ukraine necessarily. You may want to go see the national football team, but they'll want to spend some real time with the management team. They're going to want to know your proprietary advantage. I've mentioned intellectual property. There are other ways that you can keep competitors from coming after you. So understand a little bit about what your proprietary advantage is. And then scalability. Is this a business that has the potential to truly attack a big, important market? If you're small, if it's a niche, that's not helpful because it doesn't give the investor confidence that he or she will ever get his money back, right? You need to have enough scale so that eventually you can pay the investor back for the money that he or she has put in. So are you scalable? Do you have a great team? Do you have some proprietary advantage? And can you ultimately grow this thing to a very sizable enterprise? Those are the typical investment criteria that you'll mostly see most of the places around the world. So if you can check all those boxes, right? If you can sort of get into most of those and say, I understand all of these, and we've got something here, then you might get some money. And I say might because, again, I want to warn you, this is a long, difficult process in some cases. And just because you go through the whole process doesn't mean that ultimately the investor is going to write you a check. In fact, it's pretty typical for investors to look at something like 100 companies and only ever invest in 1 or 2. That's fairly typical because we see businesses all the time and we see them from industries that we like to invest in and sometimes we don't like to invest in and maybe we will invest in. So just because you go through this process doesn't mean you're going to get the money. And this goes back to my earlier comment about relationships. The sooner you can build those relationships with people who might someday be an investor, the better chance you have of, one, exiting the process when it's clear it's not going to happen sooner rather than later, or making it all through and have a trusted relationship so that you do get the money. So just because you go through the process doesn't mean you're going to get the money. The sooner you can build those relationships, the better your odds are of being successful. Okay, so let's imagine that you have met a person. Unfortunately, they're usually men, but that's changing, I think, finally. We're seeing many more women investors, which is a good thing because they come at it from a different perspective sometimes. Let's imagine that you have met an investor and you started to build the relationship. And he or she has expressed some interest in learning more about your company and has told you that he or she will think about putting some money in. So let's imagine that's the case. What's going to happen? Well, at the broad level, what's going to happen is in this due diligence process, he or she or their team is going to spend a lot of time talking to you and looking at documents and adding numbers and potentially talking to your customers and maybe talking to your partners. So just trying to go through in excruciating detail what it is about your business that would be attractive for his investment. So let's imagine that's the case, and here we go. The process typically will take months. I've seen cases where this took as much as 8 or 9 months, with a good outcome sometimes, not always. So you have to be ready for this to happen. Now, typically, it doesn't take that long. Typically, depending on who the investor is, depending on your stage of maturity, depending on the relationship you already have with that investor, this can probably take 2 or 3 months to get done. But yeah, it depends. And I'll tell you a quick story. Once upon a time, I worked for investor. My job was to go find businesses for him to invest in. And we looked at hundreds of companies, and we ended up spending about $20 million on investing into these companies. And one of them was, I met the company on the West Coast of the US, liked the guys. It looked like the technology was complementary to another business that we had already invested in. And so I flew them out to the East Coast of the US where I live. And we met with this investor that I was working for, had the meeting upstairs in his office overlooking the water. And they were looking for $2.5 million. So it was a good meeting. They described their business pretty well. We liked them. So the meeting ended, and I was literally walking them downstairs into the parking lot, and they were going to get to the airport and fly home. And I was telling them, okay, we'll start the due diligence process. And it'll probably take about a month to figure out how we want to structure a deal and if we want to do it. And at that minute, I got a phone call from my boss who was still up in his office. And he said, hey, I like these guys. Bring them back up. I want to do this deal. So I brought the guys back up, and we did the deal right there and then. I mean, literally right there, we signed a document that says, we're going to put $2.5 million into your company. That sounds like a success. But once we did the deal and we got them more involved with them, we found out some things that we didn't like about the business. Turns out that one of the guys had a very bad reputation in the industry and no customers would talk to him. Turns out the technology didn't do most of the things that they said it did and would actually have been counterproductive to connect with our other technology. Had we simply done the 1 month of due diligence on this company, we would have saved $2.5 million. I tell that story because, yes, you want to do this as quickly as possible. Yes, you want to make sure you ask all the right questions, but you also can't rush it because both the company and the investor have to be very comfortable with each other. It has to be a trusted relationship in a very deep and meaningful way. So this chart shows sort of what the process is. It can change, it can grow, and it can shrink, but it's not something that you want to take lightly. It's not something that you want to either rush or delay. It's got to be the right amount of time for the deal. And it's going to be different for every one of them. So I just say that because be prepared for some changes as you go through the process. Right? So I'm going to talk about due diligence. I want to talk about the kinds of investors that you might encounter. And then, as I said earlier, what I want to show is kind of the worst case, right? The worst possible thing you're ever going to find. And hopefully yours won't be the worst case. It'll be a little simpler, but I want to scare you a little bit with how these things might go. So let's do that. What is due diligence? Well, I've already alluded to this and you probably already got a sense, but it's worth saying anyway. Once you have an investor, you, the founding team of this enterprise, are the ones who are going to have to work hard to gather a bunch of information and to hand that information to the investor so that he or she can get to the point where a decision can be made. And the investor needs to be convinced that he or she has all the information they need. So they're going to be, as we say in the words, diligent in asking for information that he or she considers to be of value. And that can take a lot of different forms. The way I typically structure it, the way a lot of investors will typically structure it, are things like you see there on the chart. In this case, it's 5 items. What is the market structure? Who's the competition? What's happening in the markets? How do you as a business plan to attack that market? By the way, I'm a technology guy. I'm an aerospace engineer by training. I grew up in the space shuttle and the space station world, like the planned missions to the moon and Mars. So I like technology. I like software. I like blockchain. I like AI and ML. I like rockets. I like new materials. I like unmanned systems. I like drones. I like all technologies. I probably spend more time than I should on technology assessment. But again, different investors are different. So we'll describe this in a bit. You need to be able to describe to your investor what's happening in your technology? What are the major trends? Why is my technology better than somebody else's? So there will be some sort of technology assessment in this process. I've already talked a lot about management team. I'll talk more about that later because it is fundamental to the success of these businesses. What is your operating plan? Again, I alluded to this. You need to have some sort of set of milestones that you'll be executing against over time. It may change, but if you don't have a little bit of a plan sooner rather than later, then you're missing it. And then financial prospects. Again, as I'll say in a few minutes, every investor is a little different. Some will focus only on the numbers, only on finances. Depending on what kind of company I look at, I sometimes don't pay much attention at all to the finance. I'm much more interested about the size of the market and the plan to get to market and how the technology will fit in the market. So different investors will look at these differently, but all of them will ask you something about all of these. So let me go into a little bit more detail. But first, you'll hear the word risk a lot. And the word risk is often used in ways that I think is not quite correct because it's not specific enough. To me, and to the kind of investors that I deal with a lot, particularly at the early stage of companies, that idea stage or that seed stage, it's really not about risk. It really is about uncertainty. And what I mean by that is uncertainty are those things that you just don't know, right? You don't know if there's risk until you have answered some fairly specific questions about the technology and the market and so on. So, and there will be cases where you can't get rid of the risk. It's still going to be there, but you can always get rid of, or usually get rid of, the bulk of the uncertainty. And I'll talk more about this in a second here, but so every investor knows that the technology might not work. They all know that even if the management team has worked together in the past and they're really smart people and they're trying their best, sometimes they just make bad decisions, right? That's just a risk. You can't not have that happen. And sometimes the market just isn't ready and you can't do enough research to know that. But what you can do is you can specifically address uncertainty by saying, yeah, we've tested the technology and here's what we've done. Here are the results. Here's why we believe the technology is going to work. It still might fail, but this is what we've done to try to reduce the uncertainty around the technology. Similarly, you can look at the management team. As I said earlier, you want people who have worked together. You want people who know what they're doing. They understand the market. So to reduce uncertainty, here's the similar ventures we've done before. Here's how we've worked together. Here's how we interact with each other. Here's how we communicate. Here are resumes. So, and then of course, customers are the same thing. We've talked to customers. We know what the customer wants. So again, this is often a difficult concept to get, but it's really not about risk. It's about uncertainty. And the reason I use this particular picture is it's instructive on this topic. This poor woman, she's on the ledge of a cliff. I hope she's there because she wants to have fun, but she's about to plummet down this cord on a bungee cord and will have a great time doing it. But she would never do that if she wasn't completely certain that those cords and those connectors and those locks and those hooks are all solid, right? So what she's done is she has taken all the uncertainty out of her situation. She knows mostly that the rope isn't going to break, that the cords aren't going to separate, and she's not going to plummet to her death. She has taken uncertainty out of that situation. And that's why I keep saying this. Your job all day, every day, as founders of these companies, is to find ways to take uncertainty out of the equation, out of your venture. It's not about risk, it's about uncertainty. And just to bring that home a little bit, as your company grows, at the very beginning, you really don't know about the technology, you don't really know about the market, you don't really know about your team, you don't really know about a lot of things. Your uncertainty is very high. But as you grow, as you talk to customers, as you test the technology, as you meet new people, as you build partnerships, your clarity improves, your uncertainty drops, eventually you're executing a known business model and all the uncertainty is gone. But again, the message here is that your job all day, every day, at this stage of your company is to reduce uncertainty, because risk is what you get when you can measure everything, right? If you know that if you flip a coin and it lands heads or tails, that's a 50% probability. There's no uncertainty there. But uncertainty is when you can't measure these things. You don't know what you don't know. So your job all day, every day is to reduce risk in your venture. So do everything you can to reduce uncertainty. I won't spend much more time on that. I think you probably get it. Here's where I really want to get to. As you talk to more investors, what you will find is that different investors care about different things. They all care about the same things to some level, but they care about different things in terms of how important they are. And you need to be open and honest on how you plan to execute your business so that those investors can glean from you, can get from you the kind of information that they really need to make an important decision. So be open, be honest, give them what they ask for. Remember though, it's not your responsibility to tell that investor what they should consider, right? They're the ones who are trying to make a decision, and they need to understand for themselves what matters and what information they want to do. So be clear about where your responsibility is. Your responsibility is to give them the information they ask for, and not much else. I mean, if there's something you really think they should know, that's fine, but don't feel like it's your responsibility to educate them about how they should make a decision. Okay. A couple things to start and to make the process a little simpler. Get organized. Right now, you should be capturing information, sticking in a file, whether it's an electronic file or a paper file, and we'll talk about what kind of information you should be gathering, but get organized and be diligent about staying organized, because the worst thing that an entrepreneur wants to see is when he or she asks you for a piece of information, you say, well, I don't know where that is. I have to go get that. I'll give me 3 days to find it. That's not something that builds trust. So get organized, stay organized. Assign one person in your organization to communicate with the investor, primarily. As time goes on, they'll want to talk to lots of people, but have one person who is kind of a point of contact. Now, often that's the CEO, right? There's no reason for it not to be, but have at least think seriously about who that one person should be, because otherwise there's risk that there's miscommunication by having too many people in these kind of discussions. Similarly, assign one person, probably the same person, to be the point person for tracking all of these documents, right? Who owns the file? Who's got the password to the file? Make sure you have one person who is the point of contact for that stuff. This one's important too. Think of it as your process as much as the investor's process. And the reason I say that is because you're going to hear no a lot. And I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. You're going to hear the word no a lot. But if you learn about your company, if you learn about why that investor says no, that's something that you can take on and help you the next time. So as you go through this process, even if it doesn't work out, you're learning as much as the investor is learning. So think of it as your process as much as it is their process. Answer questions thoroughly, but as I said earlier, you don't need to offer more than they ask, right? If they don't want to know about a particular aspect of your finances, that's fine. Don't presume that they need to know. If they want something, they'll ask. And then use that feedback you get, as I said earlier, to make it easier the next time, because you will get told no an awful lot of times. But yeah, I've got about, I think, 10 minutes to go here, and then we'll break for questions. So let me get moving here. Oh, last thing I want to point out on this chart, this is a trust building process. So take every opportunity you can to build trust as you go through this process. So what will you be presented with? When you talk to an investor, depending on what stage they're at, what stage you're at, they will hand you a thing called the due diligence checklist. And maybe it's formal, maybe it's just an email of here's the things we want to have. This one that you're looking at here happens to be 3 pages out of a 10-page checklist that, in this case, the Angel Investment Network will typically ask for information from a startup company. And I won't go through this. I just want to point out that this sort of checklist is the kind of thing that you're going to be presented with. And again, maybe it's a formal document. Maybe it's just an email with a list of questions, followed by another email with a list of questions, followed by another email with a list of questions. So it could be a number of different things, but it will be these kinds of requests for documentation and information. And ultimately, as I said, you're going to be creating a pretty sizable stack of information. And maybe it's paper, maybe it's electronic, maybe it's a combination of both, but be ready for a lot of these kind of requests. Okay, what you'll need, I'm gonna go into more detail on this in a bit, but a lot of things. Your investor pitch documents, obviously, your executive summary. What are the documents that clarify the kind of company you are? Is it an S Corp, a C Corp, or an LLC in the US? There are other kinds of companies around the world. Do you have contracts? Who are your board of directors? Do you have patents or other trade secrets? What are your plans? All of this sort of stuff is the kinds of information you're going to be asked for, and probably more. Now, I mentioned that there, in my approach usually, there are 5 things we look at: market structure, competition, and marketing strategy, the technology assessment, the management team, the operating plan, and a financial review. So what I'm going to do next, and then I'll be mostly finished, is just show you, for example, the kinds of questions that you'll be asked for as you go through this. Okay. But one last thing before I do that, and this is an important chart. I've said this a number of times. Different investors are going to focus on different parts of this, depending on the kind of company you are and the kind of investor they are. If you're at very early stage and you're dealing mostly with your friends, your family, very, very early stage angel investors, but they're very early stuff, they're mostly going to be looking at your management team, particularly if it's your friends and family, right? They're probably not really going to understand the market that you're after. They're probably not going to understand the technology. What they're doing is they're betting on you. They know you, they grew up with you, they might be your grandmother, your mother, your father, your Uncle Harry. They know you, they trust you probably. They want to keep trusting you. So they're going to focus almost exclusively on what do you believe is the potential for this business. So be prepared that if you're going to look for money from your friends, your family, and their friends around them, that you're betting a lot on those relationships. And if you mess up, that could make going on holiday every year very difficult. So be careful. That's my advice here, is be careful if you're talking to your friends and family about investing in your company, to make sure they understand that there is some uncertainty and thus some risk in what they're getting themselves into. But mostly they're going to be betting on you with their money. When you start to talk to angel investors, and again, there are different kinds of angels. There are angels who invest at the idea stage. There are angels who invest in much larger opportunities. I mentioned the one I used to work for that would write checks for $2 million or $3 million. So there are different kinds of angels, and they tend to want to know a little bit about everything. But again, they're going to focus mostly on the management team because they want to know how well you can execute. So be ready for them to ask questions about markets and technologies and so on, but to focus much more on you. When you get to strategic investors, and again, these are the kind of entities we talked about. They might be large companies or companies in your supply chain. They might be potential acquisition partners. They're going to pay much more attention to the market, to the technology, because they think it might have some value to their technology. They're going to look at the management team, but the truth is, if they buy you or if they bring you in as partners, they're going to surround you with management anyway. So they're going to focus less on the management, on the operations, and the finances, because they're more concerned about how your product or service or technology complements their product or service or technology. So it's a different sort of a decision. Venture capitalists, of course, they want to know everything about everything. sometimes they'll not worry so much about the operating plan because they know that might change anyway, but they're going to drill very deeply into everything that you're thinking about. So, which gets me to the next point. Let's look at this worst case. And I've got about 5 minutes. I want to get through this real quick. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of this, but I want to show you a little bit about how deeply you might have to start to answer some of these questions. So this is a due diligence checklist, essentially, from a venture capitalist firm that I've worked with for a while. It's about 70 questions. And some of these questions can take a very long time to answer completely, sometimes days, to really gather the information and articulate, and there's meetings and discussions and back and forth. So this is where the process really can get long. So anyway, but don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. We can save some of this for questions. So first off, this market structure and about the market, about what's happening in the market. They're going to want to know a whole bunch of stuff. And I've highlighted just one of them here. What market are you in? Who else is in that market? What size? What are the relevant segments? Those are questions that you can answer quickly at a high level. But when you really start to drill in, this could be a meeting all by itself just to talk about this topic. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of others, which I won't spend too much time on. Here's what I do like to spend time on, though. It's how do customers make the decision to buy your product? It's shocking sometimes to talk to entrepreneurs who say, well, we're just going to go to a big company because we know they got the problem, and we'll show them the stuff, and they'll buy. And we start to ask, well, who's the decision maker? Is it the chief financial officer? Is it the CEO? Is it the operations guy? How long does it take to make that decision? How does it fit into their budgeting process? Who else could influence the decision within the organization? So these are the kind of things, again, this could be a whole meeting just on this topic alone. I mentioned, I won't go through that. I mentioned I love technology. I spend way too much time on technologies. But I do, even when I'm not worried about the technology, I do want to know what's the advantage? Why is this thing better than other ways of solving this same problem? And we always talk about this at some level. What happens if the customer does nothing and just keeps letting the problem sort of muddle along and doesn't actually need to solve the problem? Does the technology really, is it compelling enough to cause the customer to want to get active in addressing this problem? Have you applied for patents and so on? Again, we talked a lot about intellectual property. Are there ways to keep the competitors from coming after you? I can spend all day on about management. I've already said a lot about management, but again, each of these could be a fairly long discussion between you and the investor. And be ready for the investor to want to spend a lot of time with you to understand your management team. I won't spend much time on operating plan again because it probably will change, but you do need to have some sort of plan. And there will be question after question after question about how you're going to get from this point in your growth to that point in your growth. So be ready for that. I'm just going to leave this in the presentation. You can look at it on your own. This is a set of milestones, which some people use, some people don't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you have some milestones, that you believe that if you do this with a little bit of money and some time, you can do that. And if you do that, then a little bit of money and time, you can do this next thing. So be ready to have some milestones that you can articulate to the investor. Again, lots of investors will want to spend hour after hour after hour looking at your finances. I tend to do that less, but that's just me. But be ready for lots and lots and lots of questions about your financial projections and why that matters. There's more and a lot more. And yeah, I'm going to leave this in the presentation. You can look at it when you get time and ask questions if you need to, all to the good. One final thought, and then we'll go to questions. As I said earlier, it's important to focus on reducing uncertainty. The investor wants to know what he's buying with his money, right? If I give you money, how is that going to make things better? What are you going to do to take the uncertainty out of the question? So if there are things that money can't solve and you haven't mastered yet, it's okay to tell that to an investor as long as you say we've got a plan. But if there are things that money is necessary for getting to market, for hiring a team, Be clear about that as well. Just have a plan and be ready to talk about it. One final thing, final thought. You will hear the word no a lot, but there's good versions of no and bad versions of no. The bad versions of no are those silent no's where you submit the plan, you make the call, you have the meeting, and nothing ever happens. Well, shame on the investor for letting that happen. And if you perceive that that investor is just giving you that silent no, don't feel bad about cutting ties and going on to the next one. The slow no, hey, it looks interesting. We'd really like to see this and this and that and this other thing. Again, shame on the investor for that slow no. If you perceive that that's happening, move on. Then there's the no that's really a yes, or the yes that's really a no, rather. Hey, we love this. You guys are great. We love the technology, but we're busy. Can you come back in 2 months? Let's talk. Same thing. That's really a no. And if you perceive that happening, move on. The good versions of no are quick. Hey, love you, but it's not for us, and here's why. And that's something that will help you for the next investor. And there's also the no in advance. And this is on you. If you talk to an investor and find out that they really don't invest in your technology or your domain, your industry, then don't bother, right? Just, it's no in advance, move on. So there are good no's, there are bad no's. There's fault all the way around, but you can learn from this process. So do everything you can to reduce uncertainty, to learn from the process. And when the time comes, you'll be ready. And you'll find yourself creating happy customers and doing sophisticated things in emerging markets, building a great team. And I look forward to the chance to hear from all of you about the successes you have as you go forward. So that's the end of my presentation. I would love now to talk about any questions you have. I did it in just about an hour, so that's about right. And I've got time for questions. If any.
Another audience. And dear founders, do you have a question for Martin?
We have one online question from Anna Bilyavtseva.
Okay.
Is it enough for early stage startup just to sign NDA and non-compete agreement with employees? And how much equity can startup give to advisors in the early stages? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a valid question. For employees, for people who work for you, it's okay to ask for non-competes and non-disclosure. That's entirely appropriate, particularly if you believe that you have a technology that is ultimately going to be patentable, or you have trade secrets that could help competitors, or you have some knowledge about the market. So for employees, yes, I think it's entirely appropriate to sign NDAs and non-competes and so on. Be prepared in some cases for employees to not want to sign particularly non-competes. But that's just a thing between you and your employees. With respect to investors or partners, it's almost never a good idea to ask them to sign a non-disclosure too early in the process. What I mean by that is, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, if you come to me and you say, hey, I've invented anti-gravity, or I've invented warp drive, and I believe that people will care about that because it solves a problem in the market, I don't need to ask you the details of your technology. What I want to know is, how are you going to get to market? And do people really want that solution, right? So at the beginning, you don't need to sign an NDA with me. Once we get to know each other, and once we've drilled down into the details of how you're going to get to market and what problems you're going to solve and the quality of your management team, then yeah, I may want to know a little bit more about the technology. But at the beginning, you don't need to have an NDA from me, because I don't need to know, right? Similarly with some partnerships, depending on what you're asking them to do. For example, if they're a supply chain partner, they don't need to know your technology. They just need to know what the problem you're solving is, right? So be careful when you talk to investors and partners about NDAs, because it may not be necessary yet. Ultimately, yes, but not immediately.
Okay, fine, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah?
We have one more question from online, from Maria Shamota. She's very active today as well. A lot of Ukrainian startups try to incorporate somewhere outside. What are the best location for it, and should it be your investor's location or the location where your customers are? Thank you.
That's a good question. And I'm not sure there's any perfect answer to that question. Generally speaking, this is just me. I'm not sure this is the right answer to this, but I prefer to see the company established in a place where the customers are. So for example, if you're going to try to address the US market, then it makes sense to have a US division or a US entity that is tied somehow to your home country, but is established in the US. And the reason for that is because it's so much easier to form partnerships in the US when you have a US company already. And it's so much easier to get investment from a US investor into a US company. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't put an enterprise in Berlin or Warsaw or somewhere else and still make it work. But I generally think that it's better to have the company established where the market is, because regulation and taxes and all of the things that are difficult get easier when you're in the same country.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for your lecture. My name is Oksana, and we are a seed stage startup. And for example, we know that our market is quite large, but there are a few competitors. And you several times talked about that we should convince that we are valuable, that we are scalable, and we are interesting for the market. And you showed the phrase that according our personal interviews or something like that, we know that they are interested. Those personal interviews are convincing enough for investors that there are a market interest in such products that we do, because, for example, we did several personal interviews, and we see that when we ask questions, people understand that it's interesting, but they haven't thought about it before. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very good question. That's a very important question. So thanks, Oksana, for that. Yes, at the early stage, when you don't have people paying you for the product, all you really have is that customer interaction. And when we do this, we call this customer discovery. And when we do it, we encourage a company like you to have 25, 50, sometimes 100 different interviews with potential customers, asking mostly the same set of questions. And what you're looking for in that process is enough data that you can say, you know, we talked to 100 people and half of them like this feature and half of them like that feature and 25% of them like this. So that's valuable, but just as valuable, maybe even more valuable to me, are those personal testimonials. And I hope that phrase translates, but it's those responses where they say, wow, I never thought this was possible. I need this. My life will never be the same if I don't have this. Thank you, Oksana, for bringing this to my attention. Those kind of testimonials, and they happen sometimes, are really, really valuable for early stage investors like myself. So I also encourage you, as you're putting your pitch together, to make sure that you have those in the pitch. We talked to this person, they have this problem, and they said they can't live without our product. So yes, it's helpful to have those kind of testimonials and those kind of customer interactions sooner rather than later, and lots of them.
Okay, fine, thank you. Anybody else? You have a chance to ask our mentors right now. And
If not, that's okay.
we are a little bit tired. Thank you. Thank you, Marty, so much for your lecture. And we are waiting to meet you on our bootcamp. And now we're ready to go to another activities. And thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Bye.